All right, so I do want to jump right in on the heels of this rather historic event with President Biden stepping down and removing himself from the race for president for the 2024 election. Tell us a little bit, if you will, about what you expect on how the next Democratic nominee is going to be chosen.
Well, there's a formal process. The delegates have, up until now, been committed to the president. And at the Democratic National Convention, there's usually a formal process where those delegates who are pledged to Biden vote for Biden. That's a simple process. But now he's, of course, released those delegates because he's no longer seeking the nomination. And so what will happen and how the process will proceed of doling them out, of them deciding really who to choose, is open, and we're not sure. I imagine the president will say something about that in the upcoming days when he speaks to the nation. There's a range of options. One would be something like a mini primary, and there's a lot of discussion about that there would be a shortened contest to see who the nominee is, and those delegates would then be pledged to the winners of that mini primary or mini primaries. At the other end of the spectrum would be simply that there would be lobbying of the delegates to be given over to one particular candidate. And, so it's a range. I think this race is really about a battle for democracy. So it's important that the Democratic Party engage in a democratic process. So I expect there'll be some form of chance for the electorate, the Democratic Party members, to make decisions here.
So, Corey, we not only saw a change from President Biden, but now there's a question of who the nominee will be. Obviously, we've seen President Biden himself and many others go ahead and announce support for Harris, but that doesn't mean that she's locked in.
That's correct. I mean, it really is up to these delegates to decide. But let's face facts. The vice president really has national name recognition. She has a powerful narrative that she brings to this race. She's fought as a prosecutor, and after all, it would be a race against a convicted felon, and so that just looks so good for Vice President Harris. This is also a battle unlike any other. I mean, it really is that this has happened a few moments in history, as I talk about in the book that you mentioned. In 1800, there was a shutdown of the opposition party, a shutdown of free speech by President John Adams, and a pushback by the newspaper editors who were prosecuted. And what they did was they turned the election of 1800 into a battle for democracy. In 1868, Black citizens risked their lives to go out and fight for President Grant. And the opposition was a white supremacist party seeking to defend those terrorists, really, who were attacking Black people at the polls. Those two elections, 1800, 1868, were like this one. Democracy itself was on the ballot. So whoever the candidate is, that message is going to be the same.
Why do you think that these endorsements have really rolled in so quickly?
Well, I think that, frankly, Vice President Harris has real star power. She has been on the national stage for a long time as vice president, for going on 4 years. She has, as I said, the argument against Trump. And I think as people start to think to themselves, about their own ambition or about the future of democracy, the possible rivals, you saw, for instance, the governor of Kentucky endorse her today. You saw the Clintons come out very early on and endorse her. It's really more than one person. And the question is, who's got the best chance to win in November? And that's why I think you're seeing so much support solidified around the vice president.
Now, in addition to that, we have seen some notable people who many might look to step up and offer some of those endorsements, kind of hold back. What do you think that might suggest?
Well, the big person who has not stepped forth and endorsed the vice president yet, although I think it'll come soon, is, of course, the former president, President Obama. But I think he's really playing the role of neutral arbiter of this process. And so we began our discussion by talking about different possibilities for these delegates being committed to particular candidates. And I think what President Obama rightly is trying to do is make sure that, although he might have his favorite candidate, and I'm sure it is Vice President Harris, that the process is fair and that there really is democracy when it comes to the fight for democracy. After all, the nomination can't betray democracy.
Speaking of a fight, a debate is little more than a sparring of words. And we saw how the nation watched as current President Joe Biden had a less than stellar performance in the most recent debate. How do you think Vice President Harris would stack up against Trump if there were to be a debate? And do you think that's likely?
Look, the question is who can really frame the election as being about the threat to democracy? And let's, this is not an exaggeration, so I think it's just important. I think viewers know this, but to reiterate why that is. Former President Trump on January 6th didn't just help to spark a riot at the Capitol. It was an insurrection, an attempt to stay in power, what political scientists call a self-coup. That's why we're talking about threats to democracy. This isn't an abstract kind of threat, although the threats to democracy I talked about in the past were quite serious. And there was a plot by Adams to try to deny the certification of electoral votes. When he got caught doing it, he owned up, and there was a peaceful transition of power. Trump stopped, for the first time in American history, the peaceful transition of power. So who's best positioned to make that argument? My bet is on the prosecutor. And when it comes to President Biden, it's obvious he just wasn't able to do it. He got sidetracked. There was a discussion about golf that was really off point and off-putting to a lot of people. And Vice President Harris, I think, will bring that democracy theme back. I should say the act of resignation itself is a profound historical moment in American history. Why is that? George Washington really crafted the idea of the presidency as an office. In his second inaugural, he said, look, I just took an oath to the Constitution. If I violate it, criticize me. If I don't live up to it, criticize me. If I really violate it, subject me to constitutional punishment. The point is that the office of the presidency is above the occupant. It's not synonymous with the person. And so in making the decision to step down, President Biden hasn't just shown modesty and all the virtues as a person that people have commonly pointed out. He's really showing what the office means in its core, what Washington meant the office to mean. Now, President Trump has a very different idea of that office. It's about the idea that Article 2, as he puts it in his own words, gives him the power to do anything he wants. That is not the American idea of the presidency. That is not an idea of American democracy. It's a form of populism, a form of authoritarianism. We've seen past presidents. I mentioned Adams. There are others as well. President Buchanan, who lobbied the Supreme Court to deny essentially all rights to Black Americans. Woodrow Wilson, who tried to nationalize white supremacy. And of course, Richard Nixon, who operated a criminal conspiracy out of the White House. They also had an authoritarian idea of the office. But in the past, citizens fought back. They recovered the office. Jefferson and Madison put back the right to dissent, the right to criticize a president. Frederick Douglass, for decades, argued for the rights of Black Americans as equal citizens, and in the Grant administration saw that recovery happen. Unknown heroes like Sadie Alexander lobbied President Truman to put back the basic idea of equal citizenship, to get rid of the American apartheid system of segregation. President Johnson and Martin Luther King most famously fought together to restore the office. We haven't yet recovered from Richard Nixon. Those crimes were never prosecuted. And the result is that we still are stuck with an idea of a president being above the law. As you saw the Supreme Court say recently, a president is immune when it comes to his or her official duties. This election is the moment where we've got to restore democracy, restore the office. And President Biden, by stepping down and letting Vice President Harris step forward, has really made that moment possible, a recovery of democracy.
So, looking forward, just before I open the floor for you, Corey, crouching this in the context of history and what we have seen of this as a precedent, if you will, what is the voter response to this resurgence of democracy, if you will?
I think really, I mean, I'll just say from the beginning why this is so important that there be a voter response. At the founding, Patrick Henry warned of a criminal occupying the office of the presidency. He said, this is an office that's so powerful, it's designed for people of virtue. What if a criminal takes that office? He or she is going to realize there are no checks on the presidency. What's the check supposed to be? The Supreme Court? That's not going to do the job. Congress, impeachment? That's not going to do the job. And that warning was that when a president realizes his or her power, they will crown themselves a monarch. That seemed like an exaggeration before the court's immunity decision before Donald Trump. But we're seeing it in real time, the danger that Patrick Henry, who opposed ratification of the Constitution, warned of. Now, what's the way to fight back? We have had these moments before. The way to fight back is citizens reclaiming a democratic idea of the Constitution against an authoritarian one, reclaiming the right to dissent against Adams, who shut it down, Frederick Douglass, who reclaimed with his those who were supporting him the idea of equal citizenship against President Buchanan, who would deny rights to all Black Americans. Truman and Lyndon Johnson working with figures like Sadie Alexander and Martin Luther King Jr., working to destroy American apartheid once and for all. We've done it before. That's the guide for us in the future. American citizens have to demand the recovery of the idea that no person is above the law. That's, in short, what's at stake here. We didn't do it during the Nixon administration. We let him off. He was never prosecuted. This time, we have to send a message to President Trump that we're not going to allow him to crown himself a monarch, as Patrick Henry put it, that we are going to demand that he be held accountable at the polls and that he not be allowed to destroy American democracy with his authoritarian idea of the presidency.
Is there anything else, Corey, that you think is important for our viewers who hopefully are voters to keep in mind and really understand about this critical and pivotal moment of history where we're seeing a president step out of the race and possibly what could be the nation's first Black woman being placed at the top of the ticket?
What a symbol that will be to have a president who threatens authoritarianism, who had said that there are good people on both sides when there was a Nazi rally in Charlottesville, to be defeated, as I believe he will, by the first African-American female president, the first female president, and the first African-American female president. That will be a message that democracy is being restored as it has been in the past. The warning is, though, that if we fail to do this, this time we might not recover from Trump's authoritarianism. He might succeed in never holding an election again, in becoming a dictator on day one, as he put it recently. If we lose this election, if Americans, and it is a fight for American democracy, fail to restore their democracy, it might not ever be recovered. That's the danger that the book speaks of.
Thank you. And we will certainly highlight the book. As a matter of fact, go ahead and let us know what we should reach for on those bookshelves right now.
Please take a look. It's at Symposium Books and elsewhere at The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It.
Thank you so much, Corey, for joining us here on ABC6, and we look forward to speaking with you again in the future.
My pleasure. It was a great conversation. Thanks so much for having me.